Well, good evening, everyone. I seeing quite a few are now tuned in with us. It's truly great to see everybody joining in live. That's awesome. I know a lot of people are watching these after the fact. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised over the last couple of weeks. The more the views that we had on the videos after the fact have been actually great, and so I'm truly excited by that. So great to see people joining in. I saw earlier. Let's see, who did I see on there? I see Miss Judy Hayes is joining us. That's wonderful. I think I also saw Jake is also with us, and then Dean Meadows hopped on also. So grateful to see all you guys coming in from all over the different places, from Georgia, from West Virginia, from we've had people from California, from Washington, from Florida and Texas, kind of coming all over the world and all over the United States. And we also have a few that are coming in from across the globe. And so I'm very, very grateful for your presence. I am still back at my house this week. It was not my intent to be back here, except for if you've been up in the Midwest or you know anything about the Midwest around here. The last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of snow and ice. And today we were out and about, and it was like this wet snow. And so it wasn't really sticking, but it just made things nasty out. And it just wasn't a lot of fun to drive around in. And so, especially when it gets down to the colder and it gets into the 20s at nighttime and things start freezing over, it's just safer for me to be here than to be driving home from my office at late at night. So I just kind of hung out here, and I did it from here last week, and so it worked out well. Even though I don't have all my buttons and all the things that I normally would have on my live computer there, I find myself here, and I'm excited about this topic, about what this is. I'm candidly like overwhelmed by the response by some of you who have said, this is one thing. Somebody was like, "This is like your true crime concept, the true crime lover of you." There's so many of these people who have this. In fact, if you look at so much on our like Netflix and Hulu and all those different places, cults and the kind of concept that it brings about. It's a fascinating one. It really is. And I understand it. And so I'm very excited to dive into this subject. After last week's talk on critical race theory, which went almost 2 hours, which I didn't mean to, but it did. And there's so much more we could have dove into. And I'm grateful for each one of you who's followed up with me since then and asked for resources. And so, as you noted, I posted some links to books and also a couple of things. And Jovan Paya sent me a fantastic video that kind of gives a breakdown, also critical race theory, that I'm going to post in the group later on also. Definitely want you to have the ability to watch that and see some of the other ones. There's just so much that can be done in some of these subjects and topics, and I want to make sure that you feel like we're being, uh, you know, honest. So let me put it this way, real quick. My One of my professors, and I think I noticed this part one, week one, too. One of my professors in at Cambridge specifically noted one day that he was never impressed by anyone who strangles kittens. And I remember thinking that was such a weird way to phrase something. He said strangles kittens, like why? Who would ever be impressed with somebody who strangles a kitten? And he said, however, I am very impressed with someone who could take down a lion with their bare hands. And I remember thinking, well, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. And part of his argument, in essence, was to be charitable. That when you're presenting the opinions of others, that you should be as charitable as possible. You should make their arguments the lion of their arguments, not just the weakness of their arguments. And so there will be times where I will fail at that miserably, where instead of taking down the lions of the arguments, you kind of have to take down the kittens too, the little small things along the way. But our goal with this whole entire study is really to present the highest vision of how people view the differences on these subjects, not just the lowest ones, to do our best to make sure that we're balancing these things. And that's not always easy because I do have personal opinions and personal thoughts about things. And that is part of what we're doing is also my thoughts and opinions. And like I noted, you guys are welcome to chime in at any point in time. But I do want to make sure we're being honest. And so that's why I will do every week. I will try to post books and articles and videos that present sometimes both sides of things. Through my study, I have a very clear understanding of what I believe to be true. And so I do my best to follow those things and do my best to present those arguments and how I've arrived at such arguments, but never at a point where I would not encourage someone to actually do the research for themselves too, to look up at and bring about something different than what it might be. So grateful. I just saw Jovan joined us. Grateful that he can join us again. And so tonight's topic, I need to forewarn just a little bit here. Cults, while it can be a very a fun topic to look at, it can also be a tragic one to look at. And it could also be one that can be a touchy subject. There's at times, especially in the cult world, there can be a lot of exploitation. There can be a lot of trauma. There can be a lot of sexual exploitation. And so I just want to give you guys kind of a heads up on that. That's some of the things that I'll mention tonight, and some of the things that maybe that I'll post later. In some ways, will and may have some information in it that you're like, wow, that's heavy, or that's really hard. And some of it may come from your own background. It may come from your own experiences in life and the rest. And so I just want to give you a heads up on that, that this is not a light subject. This is not something that's easy to just gloss over, but instead it's something that I want to make sure we give it its due diligence and its due honor, because it's not something that just happened in the past. The cults is not something of a past generation. Cults is not something that once, that somebody else has dealt with, but not us. Cults is not something that is just a fun topic. It's not just something you see on Netflix and the rest. It is a reality for a lot of people and for a lot of situations. But as we begin, and I see we've got about 9 or 10 of you guys that are live right now. I love that. I want to ask you what your definition of a cult is. And so if you'll write that in the comments, what is your definition of a cult? And so I've got this down here also so I can see some of the comments and the rest. So what is your definition of a cult? And I'd be fascinated to see what might come up here. What is your definition of a cult? And so I'm doing my best to try to keep this to where I can see things too, and balance this all out and see where we're at so I can see the comments at the same time. All right, so definition of a cult. And some of you may not know. Some of you may be like, I haven't spent a whole lot of time on this, so I have no clue. Don't know what a cult is. Don't have any thoughts on this. But does anybody have any idea what might be? So a group that exercises total control over the lives of its members, either by force or extreme social pressure. Okay, I like that. And by the way, I can, if you will, I put a link earlier where you can actually see that I can add different posts at times to the actual live. And so I can drop on these lovely little things like this when Jovan told me less. This is why if you give us permission to be able to post your comments, it makes it a little bit easier to post these things. And so just giving you a heads up, you can do that. So if you want to click on that link, or if I need to post the link again, it should be higher up on the thread. It gives Facebook the access for us to be able to actually share those things. All right, so I got also a group that tends to separate the members from society and usually into sexual exploitation. Okay, so that's from David Clevenger, appreciate that. And then also leadership which restricts free thought and forces manipulation upon filers. All right, fantastic. So I do like that there are actual answers in here, and these are well thought out answers, and I really do appreciate all of those. And all of them, I think, are fairly spot on. And so I think they're fantastic from that point. And so I don't want to take away from that. I think you guys are right on topic for that. Let me say this as I dive into this. I have done a lot of research on cults, and a lot of my, I guess, my fascination with them started when I actually took a class on cults called The Psychology of Cults. And this was about 3 or 4 years ago. Probably one of my favorite classes I've ever taken. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of different things, mainly because the question I just asked, which is what is a cult? It's a really hard thing because there is no hard set definition. As an example, and some of you may or may not agree with this, and you can tell me what you think, but there are people who, when they hear the words Church of Christ, think cult. Now, there's a reason for that. I wonder if there's anybody out there who might be able to tell me why that is the way that it is. Why are there certain people out there when they think Church of Christ, they think cult? Anybody know any history? I want to see if we're getting some thoughts on this. Why might someone hear the word Church of Christ and think cult? This will be fascinating to see if how many know a little bit of our history. The Boston movement, okay? The Boston movement and some other stuff, disfellowshipping of members is also one that we might see that. But the Boston movement is the key one. Um, and I'll give you the reason for that right now. The reason for the fact that the Boston movement, and I appreciate David Clevenger saying that one, being the key one, is also known as the ICOC, as I think Jovan just posted a second ago. And Rich Byron also noted, well, the Crossroads movement was also one of the names that it had. In fact, it changed quite a few times, its name. Um, when I arrived at Harvard, one of the things I found out very quickly was that the Churches of Christ are banned from campus. And I went, what do you mean the Churches of Christ are banned from campus? And I couldn't comprehend in that moment why that was the case until I realized that they were referencing the Boston movement that came out of the 70s and 80s, the Jesus movement, which began at the Crossroads Church of Christ down in Gainesville, Florida. Kip McKean and others that kind of launched that before he came up to Boston. And just as an interesting tidbit, the church that I'm at right now, the Church of Christ on Fishinger Road, where we're at, and where I'm coming to you from here in Columbus, at one point in time, Kip McKean actually looked to be the campus minister here. And the very job that I'm currently in tied to the Crossroads movement, the Boston movement. And this was back in, I think, the 70s, somewhere around there, 70s or 80s, back in those times. And so there are people who I have met and people who I've spent time with along the way who, well, when they hear the word Church of Christ, they instantly go, oh, that's a cult. In fact, that was my direct experience at Harvard with some of the professors who had a very clear understanding that, oh, that's not possible. And so when I was actually, becoming a Harvard Global Ambassador where I could represent the school, one of the questions they asked me was, are you part of any banned groups? And I said, I'm not, but I need you to understand I am a member of the Churches of Christ, but I'm not part of the International Church of Christ. I'm not part of the discipleship movement, which was the Boston movement, all of those types of things. And I had to make that very clear. Now, this was in 2019, 2020. And so you might think, well, that's crazy. That's long memories. There are groups that are still banned on campuses, even in the United States, because of cult-like connections. Now, you have to understand that part of the problem with the Crossroads movement is it's very different than the Churches of Christ that you or I may be part of today, and probably very different than some of the other religious groups others that are here watching tonight would know or understand. It's very, very different, but the names are the same, or at least the association is. I do believe they go by the International Churches of Christ now, but that's a distinction without a lot of merit for some people because it still sounds like the same. And I see Jovan just said that he's had a similar experience to that, where people are kind of shocked or they wonder when you make that connection when you use that terminology. So that was the first time that it happened to me. Now I remember as a child uh, when I was in Italy, I remember hearing about the Boston movement specifically that had come over to Italy and was looking to plant a church somewhere, but it never really connected with a lot of people. And it didn't really connect with me in the moment. And it definitely didn't take in the Italian churches where we were. But there were some who were like, well, no, that's a Church of Christ. And then you look at it and go, that's not the Churches of Christ the way that we know them. And so even the name can be problematic, which is why a lot of cults over time actually change their names pretty consistently. And we noticed that, if you noted, you had the Crossroads Church of Christ in Gainesville, Florida, and then it became known as the Crossroads Movement. And then it kind of became, when it took root, not just from Florida, but all the way up before that. But before it was the Crossroads Movement, I think it was known as kind of like, more broadly speaking, the Jesus Movement. And a lot of that, even the Joy Bus concept came around because of that. Where you would go into communities and you would pick up the kids and buses and the joy buses and take them to church and things like that. So a lot of really good things, but then they kind of changed and more from there. So, and Rich just noticed, yeah, big city names, like they became like the Chicago Church of Christ, Milwaukee, I'm trying to think some of the big ones, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, and so forth. Like they became kind of mother church, parachurch organizations in the essence, and they are still around. Um, Not only that, why even though they've rebranded a little bit, they are still around in big way. I saw an article or a little video, I think it was 2 days ago, that directly noted that the Crossroads Church of Christ, which is down in Gainesville, which had kind of separated itself from the International Churches of Christ years ago, and they have since renamed and become the Campus Church of Christ there in Gainesville, Florida, has now reunified with the local International Church of Christ there in Gainesville, Florida. And so the International Church of Christ has sold their building and has now become part of the campus. So it's like, and they're making a big deal about it being like, this is a really cool thing, really big thing. Like they've been reunified together for the first time in 30, 40 years. And I just found that fascinating, that it's still around. It's still part of the thought process. And you'd have to connect with them to see if it's still the level of what people would call cult behavior. I don't know. It doesn't show up as often. I will note there was actually a Fox News article probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago that actually talked about the church, the ICOC, was actually being sued by some former members for some sexual exploitation and child abuse and things like that I believe, out in California, including some of the leaders and former people. So there is this tendency, but I don't want to get lost, and accusations can happen no matter whether it's a cult or not, because the reality is sexual sin is sexual sin, and there's no churches, whether cult or mainline or whatever, where that's not an issue at times, where sin is not sinful, where it's not prevalent as sadly in the lives of the members along the way. So that's kind of how I want you to introduce, like where that started, and that this led me down to a rabbit hole of a lot of different things, because it was actually a few years before that that really opened up my eyes to what it meant to have to deal with a cult. And so let me ask you this question. Have any of you dealt with a cult in real life? So you just put yes or no, or watched on TV or whatever, but has anybody ever actually dealt with people who are in a cult, or at least the way you would define it in a cult? Okay, got no. All right, appreciate that. Yeah. Okay, Adam has. All right. Adam, I'd be fascinated to tell me if you know which ones that might be, or if they have a specific name in some way or another. Feel free; you don't have to share publicly if it is an issue. But okay, Jovan says yes. Awesome. Okay, and Jovan, you can do the same. You can tell me if you know the name of the cult or the name of the individual group. Um, okay, so there's a few of you who have dealt with different groups along the way, which is fascinating. I mean, it really is. We often think it's something kind of at a distance, but it's not. Okay, a couple of you have said yes. All right. Now I'm going to do a couple of things. I have no kidding, and I joked about last week. I was going to do my best to not um, not spend 2 hours, but I could probably go on for 6 days on cults. Okay, I see Isaac Mays also noted. What's up, Isaac? It's great to see you. Dr. Girl from ICOC, misconceptions of mainline church. I'm not surprised by her having misconceptions that all the church required women to wear head coverings and similar legalistic practices. Yeah, ICOC. Mormon group. Okay, so that's an interesting one. And Jovan mentions is the ICOC, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the LDS, which is the Mormon group. So this is part of the question, because depending on what you believe or what you think, is Mormonism a cult? And so this was, in fact, one of the prevalent thought processes of the class that I took at Harvard. Was every week we would do a deep dive into a different group, and the answer was always, "Is this a cult?" And I say the answer because even though it was a question, that was the entire point. It's based off of what you've studied, based off of what you know. How do you define what a cult is? Because we as religious people have to be careful, for a reason, because there are things that we believe that go beyond just the physical realm. There are things that we believe beyond just what is in this world. And so it would be very easy to find ourselves mocking or even saying things like, well, I can't believe somebody would believe that. And then people look at us and go, you believed that God sent his son to come and die on a cross in the Middle East in the first century, and then every week you partake in an aspect of cannibalism where you eat and drink his body and blood and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of even the way we term things and when we speak of things that those outside would look at and go, that's kind of cult like, cultish in some way or another. So, this idea of is it a cult is a fascinating one. And so, yeah, even Catholicism can be, if you look at certain aspects of it, depending on how we're going to define it, that's going to be a key component. When Jovan notes, and in fact, I will add this to this, and so people, everybody can see it. He said, when I was in college, I was banned from a campus policy because of the ICOC. Also had daily debates over the ICOC that a mainliner was on campus, so I had to debate every day. Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm not surprised by these types of things. It happens. It happens even to this day. Um, so let's dive into some of the things, and I'm going to give you a list in the next couple of days in the group, and I hope you'll join in on the group. If you're watching this after the fact, whatever it may be, you'll join in some of the discussions, some of the things we have. I'm going to be posting kind of almost every day over the next couple of days, different cults with sometimes there's documentaries, sometimes there's videos where you can go watch them on Hulu, Netflix, whatever it may be, on different cults. And I just want you to think through that question. Is this a cult? Is this something real? Is this, how would I quantify this? How would I define this? So as I was noting at the beginning, let me go back to where my first interactions with cults came in, my real life experience with a cult. And I've got some notes here I want to share with you. When I was in China in 2005 and then 6 and then 7, I was working with underground churches, and by underground, typically we're talking about apartment churches, churches that were working out of houses. Sometimes we met in parks, sometimes we met at local libraries, at different places. We would just kind of meet wherever it was available. We tried to switch it up as much as possible. On my campus, we had a lot of freedom. There wasn't a lot of issues there. We were followed. We did have our phones tapped. We did have all sorts. We had a video camera outside of our door that looked on our apartment building that I played a game for 2 years where I would throw a t-shirt over the camera. At the end of the day, the t-shirt would be on the ground, so I'd throw it back up there. We did this for to about 2 years. And so there was a lot of things. That was mainly the Chinese government. But I started hearing some different things about some other Chinese underground cults, is the way that they would quantify them. And I was always surprised by that because I didn't really know what to think about it much. And I was like, well, I know, I guess there are underground churches. I mean, I'm part of an underground church, but I never really quantified to me that there might be those who do believe other things that would be cultish. And so one in particular that's known in China is the Falun Gong. Falun Gong is actually banned in China. It's viewed as a terrorist organization. And it's also one of the reasons why a lot of the Chinese government is very skeptical about any underground churches. And one of the reasons why China will say it's legal for Christians to worship in China. China is a freely religious country. That's the way at least they quantify it, because they assimilate all Christianity into one group and basically tell people this is what you are to believe. This is what you are to do. So they have what's called the Three Self Church in China, which is where they say, no, all Christians can come and worship at the Three Self Church anytime they want. Problem is if you're a New Testament Christian, they have the pastors and the priests, and they have the choirs and the instrumental music, and they only take the Lord's Supper 2 days of the year, Christmas and Easter, and so they have this Catholic mixture with Protestantism and the rest. It's like a conglomeration of all Christian denominationalism. And if you're a New Testament Christian, that's just not a place or way in which you can worship, and so that becomes problematic. Is that you can't be or do the things that they say, well, no, that's legal. You can absolutely be a Christian in China. So you meet in houses. Well, there's a lot of other groups that do the same. And so they meet, and it allows them to be connected together with all these other paramilitary groups, anti-government groups, and the rest that are also meeting underground. And so they view them as suspect, as problematic. And so there's a lot of persecution that goes on, whether it is real or it is just assumed in some way or another. It's tough to balance. And so that was my experience in China until we started hearing of a group that would pose as what we would often call seekers, people who are interested in studying the Bible, and they wanted to come and be part of it. And they would seem to be very overly eager. And so I had some friends that were in Shanghai at the time who told me, be careful of this group. They've been kind of, what they do is they infiltrate a group by acting like seekers. They'll study for a few weeks, then they'll become baptized, they'll become believers, and they'll try to figure out who the local leaders are in the house church movement. And what they'll then do is invite them away for a weekend to meet their families or things like that. And all of this, I was going, wow, this sounds very familiar to a lot of the experiences I've had with some of the Chinese Christians that have become believers at this point in time. He said, and then they'll try to get them in compromising positions. Typically, they'll try to send prostitutes to their room at night if they're staying at home and try to get photos of them with them. They'll try to get them drunk and humiliate them and utilize the concept of saving face, which is a very Chinese concept of honor, and put them in compromising positions to a point then that they then blackmail them when they go back to their home congregations, their home churches, their house churches, to begin teaching something different. And it's that something different that's the key thing. And so I experienced this firsthand. I had two brothers who showed up out of nowhere in one of the small house churches in Wuhan. There was about 9 of them that I went and visited it with at different times across the city. And David, you just said it right there. It's the Eastern Lightning Cult, is what they're actually known as. And the Eastern Lightning Cult is a fascinating cult. But I dealt with it firsthand in that they came into our place. They started, but I got some weird red flags about them. They were too eager. It was too. It was different, and my alarm was already raised up at that point a little bit at that time because of what I'd heard. And 2 of the brothers from the house church there said, no, we need to teach them about Jesus. And I went, just be careful, please be careful. And a couple weeks later, they were baptized, and they said, no, this is wonderful. I said, please just be careful. I just get this weird feeling about them. And I found out about 2 weeks later, I got a call from one of the sisters and said, we don't know where our 2 brothers and our house leaders have gone. And so I was like, oh, this is terrible. Where they've gone? And they had both been killed, had both been murdered. And they had, apparently, from what we could piece together, they had been taken away for the weekend. They'd been invited away for the weekend like they was done. They may have tried to get them in compromising positions or get things from them or get them drunk or something of that nature to have them lose face so that they would then owe these guys in some way. It looks like they held firm, held strong, and did not do that and do not do what they were going to do. And so instead of returning to the house church, they simply killed them. And it was heartbreaking, and it was just unbelievably hard, because here you have 2 brothers in Christ who I love dearly, who have lost their lives out of a sense of wanting to teach others the gospel, but all tied into this cult. And so when I got to my grad school work, I had an opportunity to do a presentation on this very cult. And so I'm going to share that with you tonight. And so I'm going to move up to the top up here, I think, here in a second. So you should still be able to see me. But I want to kind of give you a rundown of the Eastern Lightning Cult. But it is actually, in our modern time, known as the Church of Almighty God. In fact, they have an unbelievably active Facebook page, social media presence. They have a website, a bookstore, all sorts of stuff that is available even to this day, wherever you may be. And that is a fascinating thing when you stop and think about it for a second, because how could this be? I mean, they have, there's this, they're known for this. It's known around the world for these atrocities, and yet here we are. How in the world could this be that they're still around? So just to give you some background, the founders, and it was founded in 1991 in mainland China. Yang Xiangbin was the woman that you see there on the left. She is Jesus Christ returned. She's the reincarnation of Jesus, and gets direct revelations from the Holy Spirit. She is also known to have a history of mental health issues that go back decades prior to this situation. There's also Zhao Weishan, who was born in 1951, as you see there. He is known as the Lord of Ability. And he was a house church leader, and that was from an underground group that you might want to look into, called the Shouters. They were very charismatic, but they were house church leaders, charismatic, that became banned in the late 80s. And like I said, Shouters were banned in 1989. And then Xiangbin and Wei Shan, they met in 1991. And by 1992, they declared that Xiangbin is Christ and Wei Shan is the man used by the Holy Spirit. So in essence, he is the prophet. She is the Lord Jesus Christ reincarnated. They have 3 to 4 million active members globally right now. So this goes into my question a little bit on what's your definition of a cult? So 3 to 4 million active members. Has your experience been cults are typically small? Cults are typically smaller group dynamics or have one charismatic leader, because here you have two. So what's been your experience? Does this change your thought process about the fact that there's 3 to 4 million people within this premise? And you can type it in the comments. Let me know. What is your thought on that? On 3 to 4 million active members globally, even to this day. So let me give you a couple of more backgrounds on this. Their belief systems, where it comes from. They believe, as is written in Matthew 24:27, that Jesus would return like the lightning from the east. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so that's the very premise of the lightning from the east. She is the lightning from the east that is returning. And they also make connections to Revelations 12:3-6, which is the great red dragon. And so in the Revelation, they see the great red dragon as being the perpetuation of China itself. China is the great red dragon. And so that's the connecting point that they make here. And what it reads is, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So from this concept, you can see the child that would have been, that is the one that is to come. She is the woman that is giving birth. The red dragon is China. And they took existing underground churches and they kind of assimilated into them. And as I said, it's been through kind of social manipulation where this actually gave us an understanding of how this is playing itself out. So, Rich, notice he says, I think successful cults become largest followers, believers use one another to justify their belief. Yes, in fact, that's often. Uh, so social cues are often taken by the people that are around us. We tend to gain from connecting with what others do. And so if somebody believes in a certain things, we tend to, or acts in a certain way, we tend to follow suit. And so these social norms are absolutely part of how we go from, these two in a house church to 3 to 4 million global. And so they have an organization, much like global churches, organized by local leaders, provincial and church leaders, and national leaders. They have a structure that has been set up, that is built up across the world, because this is the fascinating part. We'll look at the methodology here in a second, but they are now in the United States. Now, I don't mean just the cult. I mean the two of them have been granted religious asylum in the United States as being persecuted by the Chinese government for theological or religious reasons. They've been granted theological religious exemption because of their belief system, which is just fascinating. We think like we because of our very open religious nature allow anybody really to set up. And so these people who are being persecuted in China have now come over to the United States. We've granted them asylum for their religious beliefs, even though, and I make the argument, they are a cult in and of itself. So let's look at how they did that. They find existing house churches posing as seekers. They would study with leaders and follow the teaching of the house church leaders. They would gain favor within the group, invite leaders to the home, which is their Chinese custom, and place leaders in compromising situations, blackmail leaders until they agree to teach the gospel of truth, and slowly subvert entire underground church network through infiltration and blackmailing local leaders and preachers. The exact experience that I had is their exact format, how they often do this. This is also how you grow a group from just a small amount to 3 to 4 million. Because instead of converting one at a time, what you're doing is going in and finding entire church networks by changing just a few, the leaders, and then blackmailing them to a point where then suddenly you go from, instead of just 2 or 3 people that you may convert from a group, you can get 30 to 40 at a time because they believe the church leaders, and it becomes a process and a cycle that continues to go. So here is their website today, where you can actually go and look at all the different things that they have. You can watch and see what they have available. Which is a fascinating read if you ever want to go on there. Their production value on their videos on Facebook is second to none. It's fascinating. I believe at this point in time I've been banned from their Facebook page, not because of anything that I've said or done, but they are very, very touchy about anything. So even I think posting this video, there are people who might say or do something. It's one of the reasons I didn't directly note the Church of the Eastern Lightning Cult, the Church of the Almighty God, or the Eastern Lightning Cult. But this is where you can find out what they believe. They have revelations and prophecies. You see the videos that they have available, testimonials. They have hymns. They sing. So they're very similar in a lot of ways, even to what we would consider the church. So they sing. They have a lot of connections and time points to underground churches specifically. They don't really use instruments. They tend to sing hymns and songs along that way, in the same way that we do, which I find fascinating. So you also see, I believe this is their actual Facebook page, and so you can actually go and see this anytime you want. You can go and look at what they teach, and this is all readily available. Yet they're known for quite a few things, and that's what I'll get into here on this last page. Uh, they were banned in 1995 by China's Ministry of Public Security as being anti-China. Now, here's the fascinating way that turns about. So they believe that China is the fiery red dragon who is going after the woman, and she is the woman. And since she is the woman and China is coming after her, then China is inherently part of the revelation that must come about, and so China must be overthrown. So they are anti-government in their teaching, and thus they were banned in 1995. In 2002, there was a massive thing, was a mass kidnapping of 34 leaders of the China Gospel Fellowship. I believe it was either in Beijing or Shanghai, one of the two. And you can actually find all of these articles online. You can go look these up. Look up the 2002 mass kidnapping and see what happened, where they tried to do a literal mass kidnapping of a bunch of leaders all at once, and it backfired because there was a lot of people that pulled out and said, "No, I'm not doing this. I don't care what you say or do to me. I'm not going to. This is not going to happen." In 2012, many of you might remember the Mayan prediction of the end of the world. They were accused of riots with 400 to 1,000 arrested. Min Yong-jung accused of killing one woman and 23 students, stabbing and burning, motivated by this group. You may have seen, like if you were to look that name up and look up what would happen there, she was a member and directly was associated with trying to bring about the end times by stirring up China, stirring up the persecution against the group. And this is one of the things that I will note here in a minute. Persecution against the group validates to the group that they are who they say they are. So the more that they're persecuted, the more they believe they actually are who they say they are. So they actively seek persecution by doing things that would bring about the government, because it's their way of fulfilling what they believe they actually are. So, I mean, it's the circular logic concept of it is fascinating, but it is what it is. 2014, we have the murder of Wu Xiaoyan. It's known as the McDonald's murder. A woman was murdered at McDonald's for not giving over her phone number. They wanted her phone number. She refused to give her phone number. All had ties with the ELC. They murdered her in the murder, literally in the McDonald's lot there. And there were 5 people arrested. All had ties with the ELC, the Eastern Lightning Cult, but had kind of formed their own group that were trying to start off their own little section too. And China cracked down big time in 2014, again on the Eastern Lightning Cult. In 2019, during the Israeli election, because they were trying to bring about the end of times, dozens of Hebrew language accounts run by the church were suspended, run by the Church of the Almighty God, were suspended online because they were trying to bring about the prophecies and the end of times, massive issues with how they were trying to subvert the election and the rest for religious reasons based on their understanding of Revelation and the rest. Truly fascinating concepts when you stop and think about it. It blows my mind that this cult is not only alive and well today, but practices its faith in the United States. I believe they're in New York City, even though they're under kind of protection in a lot of ways. They don't have a public persona. They are very public in social media, though, and how they share different things. So that's the Church of the Almighty God. And I have a couple other things that I want to mention to you, and a couple other cults that I'm going to share with you. But probably my most, I want to see if somebody can guess what I would call, this is my opinion, so I'm asking you to see if you can guess my opinion. What is the number one cult in America today? And I will tell you, I don't believe it's Mormonism, but there is a particular cult that is very active today, that is very much in the media a lot. It has a lot of major cities. It has some fairly big buildings at times and the rest, but I would easily classify it as a cult. I wonder if anybody can guess what it might be. What cult it might be. We'll see if anybody can. Even an educated guess is fine. David Clevenger, man, you are on fire tonight. Rich Meyer, man, I'm not touching that one. Democratic Party, man, you could say that about a lot of our political parties in a lot of ways, and I do have a political opinion on things, but Scientology is 100% correct. In fact, it's one of those things where I may do a separate one in the future, a separate evening just on Scientology. Um, as a discussion point because it is such a prevalent concept and people don't realize how much it influences people's perception of Christianity, how much it influences people's perception of religion and of faith. And more recently, it's become very more prominent because of, and I'm trying to remember her name right now. She's a former Scientologist that has now gone out. She was on King of Queens, the actress. She's now gone out of her way to really do her best to break out of not just Scientology, but to help people come out of Scientology. Very, very active in it for a long time. Leah Remini, that's her name, Leah Remini. And they have done a fantastic documentary that's available that I'll post and let you all see that on Scientology today. Just a fascinating thought. But I want to share just a couple of things. Yes, in fact, Leah Remini. So I want to post a couple of things and mention to you a couple other cults and give you some thoughts on what is often called social proof. So social proof is, and Isaac Scientology is responsible for the biggest infiltration of the U.S. government. I would 100% agree with that, with what I've seen and what I've read over the years on Scientology, without a doubt. So social proof is the kind of the final thing that I'll share with you all tonight as we dive through this. Social proof is the premise of how one interacts based off of the other people's actions. Now, this may seem like an odd thing to say because we don't think about it very often, but it actually plays itself out fairly consistently, even in our own churches. So, for example, on a Sunday morning, if you were to arrive at a church and everyone was wearing a suit and tie, but you were not, the next week when you go back, you might think twice before not wearing what everyone else wore. And in culture, this has been happening for, well, since the beginning of time, in essence, in a lot of ways, since culture really came about. We have this uh, connection of social proof where we look at the social norms and the social aspects of what's happening and we accept those and go into them. And a lot of cults, this is one of the key things that happens. It's called social proof. And so I want to just share with you something I wrote a little while back, but especially in relation to Heaven's Gate, which is a fascinating cult if you ever want to look at it, because it actually breaks from a lot of the norms of of cults in today's world. So, for example, a lot of cults have one major leader. At least the way. In fact, one of those that would be like David Koresh or others, the Manson family, which was a cult in and of itself. But T and Doe, as they were known, Applewhite and I forget her name, were two leaders of the Heaven's Gate cult, and cults kind of became into fashion as part of in the early '90s in some ways because of the mass suicide of the Heaven's Gate cult in San Diego, California, in the I think '93, '92, somewhere around there. The Haley Bopp comet that came through, and it was they actually kicked off one of the biggest campaigns for Nike tennis shoes in the history of Nike came about because of the Haley Bopp comet suicide of the Heaven's Gate cult. And that's a story for another day, but I'll definitely share that one too if y'all are interested in knowing more about it. But I want to look at a couple of different ones, but specifically Heaven's Gate, one called the Children of God, the Manson family, the Branch Davidians. And so we're going to go through this a little bit just to kind of give you some thought process. So one of the most fascinating aspects of the study of cults is social proofs that underlie so many of these groups represented. And while there is much to be studied as to why people join or how one could believe certain ideas and ideals, it is the aspect of why they stay that I constantly find fascinating. Why do people stay in these cults? What keeps them there? And so, what is it that keeps a person from leaving a group knowing it is often dangerous, both physically and psychologically, especially within a life of a cult? And that's why I want to look at kind of Heaven's Gate, Children of God, Manson family, Branch Davidians, and the rest. Now, the Branch Davidians are a fascinating thing because let me note that real quick. A lot of times we'll say David Koresh and the Branch Davidians because the Branch Davidians predate David Koresh by about 80 years. So the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, had been around for a long time before David Koresh came in, connected in with them. It kind of took over as a very charismatic leader in the rest, and actually sparked the mass catastrophe that happened there in Waco, Texas, in the mid '90s. With the U.S. government and the ATF and the rest. So I want to make sure I differentiate that because the Branch Davidians were their own separate group long before David Koresh came in as a charismatic leader. So social proof, and this is kind of where I'll give you kind of my definition in its simplicity, is one way that individuals determine appropriate behavior for themselves in a situation is to examine the behavior of others, especially similar others. It is through the social comparisons with referent others that people validate the correctness of their opinions and decisions. So this shouldn't surprise you. In fact, it's like if you follow people on social media, you're going to end up in an echo chamber of a lot of times agreeing only with the people that are participating and connecting with only the people who already agree with you. You create echo chambers. So social proof looks at the behavior of those around you, and then you validate your own behavior based off of those around you. So if everyone is acting a certain way, then we shouldn't be surprised that then you might find yourself going, well, maybe this is the way I'm supposed to be living or acting in some way. Social proof is most influential when decision makers are uncertain about the value of a course of action and when they're able to observe the action of similar others as their guiding point. Now, boy, this falls into line a lot of just religious thought processes. Like we watch and see what others do. This is often how we portray and play ourselves out. Um, and so I think you asked the question, Heidi, is TikTok a cult? TikTok obviously is a social media app in and of itself, but the narcissistic concept behavior that can come out about it can lead to that in some way. But I think there's behavior that can come about where it draws out what I would call social proof. So social proof is absolutely part of the trends that people follow because of what somebody else did, and they see this behavior as being okay, and people got validation and views, and thus they do it again. So yeah, I do think there's an aspect where that could be the case, where at least social proof, which is an aspect of cult behavior, could absolutely be seen in that way. So it is a tool. It is one of the steps of cult behavior. So let's look at Heaven's Gate. Like I said, I'll post some links. There's actually YouTube videos of I believe it's Doe, who's specifically talking through like how to join and who he is and that he is the Son of God. And he uses the terminology of being part of the kingdom of God. I mean, a lot of this is tied to Christianity in some ways, or at least forms of Christianity. And so I'll post those links and videos later for everybody too. So in Heaven's Gates, there's a strong sense of social proof that permeates the group and their daily behaviors. And while their daily behaviors and they're like very strict work ethic, they woke up at a certain morning and time, very different than a lot of the other cults. They were very strict in their work ethic, very strict on their waking up. There was an abstinence from sex and drugs, which is also very different than other cults. So they were not about the sexual aspect. They were not about the drugs like a lot of other cults have found themselves to be in, which was outside the norm. It is also the extreme emasculation and castration aspects of this group that stands out as a living example of social proof. So that's actually something that happened in these groups, that their bodies were merely vessels for what was to come, for the area beyond this life, and for the life of the spiritual and so forth. And so the goal while in this world was to basically beat your body into submission, to have no sexual identity, to make yourself as ambiguous as you possibly could. No, to a point where they would literally emasculate themselves, castrate themselves as proof of that this body was no longer theirs. And while no one person was ever forced into castrating themselves, there was social encouragement, and it gave evidence to a higher calling if one was willing to do that. So this cultural anomaly, the self-emasculation, is found solely in social proof within the existing cult life of the, especially these Heaven's Gate cult. It is also notable that the belief in the body being a simple vehicle for the soul to return home to the alien nation from which we came led this group ultimately to commit mass suicide. And this mass suicide, which in and of itself is a cultural norm that breaks the bounds of accepted self-serving behavior, is only made possible by the acceptance and belief, or a social proof, that they all shared in the bodies being temporary vehicles. But without this understanding and group acceptance, the actions of these individuals would seem horrific and countercultural. However, members who left the cult only to see them commit suicide without their participation would soon join them by committing suicide days and weeks after their friends all died. So here's what you need to know. The 30, I think it's 38 or 39 that committed suicide on the specific day, there were those who had left the cult, saw them commit mass suicide and kill themselves there, and then went, oh, wow, that's fantastic. We should do that too. So even though they had left, they found themselves almost as copycat suicides because of the social proof that was the accepted norm. And they saw how even the world reacted to it. And they went, well, the people just don't understand. So the Children of God, this is the cult that's called the Children of God, is a terrible dynamic, and social proof is horrific. Here is where we're talking about the sexual exploitation of men and women and so forth on a level that most people can't understand. One of the clearest aspects of social proof was the normalization of what was called sharing, which was the sexual expectation for women to make themselves available to any man at any point in time in the cult. Beyond the aspect of sharing and within the framework of evangelism, women were also encouraged to what they literally called flirty fishing, which was dating to convert. They were encouraged to sleep with men if they would be willing to join the cult. Married women with their children and husband at home found themselves working bars and clubs, seeking to bring home other men to grow the cult. How in the world is this acceptable? Well, it's acceptable if everyone's doing it. That's the social proof. If everyone within the cult is doing it, then that would be what was happening. So even if they were unable to convert a man to their way of thinking, they were at least encouraged to get paid for sleeping with the individual, thus helping support financially the cult. More social proof. So this is where the pimping out of women and children and the rest became a horrific aspect of this specific cult called the Children of God. And I want to go and look it up, but I believe it's the Children of God cult where there's a few celebrities that we have in Hollywood that came out of this specific cult. I believe the Phoenix brothers, so River Phoenix and Joaquin Phoenix, and also I believe it is who else came out of this cult? I think those are the main two that I can remember that came out of this cult. But there may be one or two others that also came out of it. Now let's take the Manson family. So most of you may know the Manson, Charles Manson, and the rest as kind of a psycho and so forth. But the Manson family is an interesting challenge as it pertains to social proof. So much of their activities, including the murders and killings instigated by Charles Manson himself, dealt with a pack mentality that goes back to a social desire to be wanted and accepted. The women that Manson controlled through drugs and his charisma were deeply rooted in their desire to please and affirm actions that they deemed normative within their family. Complete devotion to Charles Manson and his will and desire. The race baiting psychedelic trips that Manson preached and gave life to led to new kind of societal and cultural norm for those within his family. One of which life was meaningless and the Great Race War was at hand. So you got to get into it. So even though the belief was not that of the culture of the day, it became the accepted norm within their family. And this new normative behavior would eventually lead to mass murder, a show trial filled with singing girls and shaved heads and random rants, all inspired and instigated by Charles Manson and social proof in existence within his cult family. The Branch Davidians. David Koresh is their leader in the end, are living proof of what happens when social proofs become the new norm. And while the Branch Davidians had been around for almost a century, it took a man such as David Koresh kind of to come in and set new societal norms to change them from a fringe cult group into an anti-government, end of times doomsday cult looking to bring about the fifth seal of the scroll of Revelation. That's literally what the premise was. This very drastic change included becoming heavily weaponized, including paramilitary training, a disintegration of all marriages, an advent of pedophilia and polygamy in a cult culture that did not hold such beliefs prior to the arrival of David Koresh. It wasn't there. And this drastic change did not come about simply because of the teaching of David Koresh, but also because of the natural acceptance of the Branch Davidians to allow such a thing to happen. Their desire to bring about the end of the world, to usher in the end times, directly led them to an acceptance of cultural norms for outside of their historical beliefs and teachings. And while David Koresh and his teachings definitely led to a new cultural norm for this group, it was the willingness of those within the cult family to follow such orders that directly changed this fringe religious group into a doomsday cult and ultimately led to the death of most of their members and this fiery explosion. And if you haven't seen it, you can go watch live. You can see the live news and the rest. I mean, it's horrific to watch. So social proof, as I've kind of noted, is one of the most major underlying factors that lead many cult members to not only stay within the cult they are in, but social proof also reinforces their belief in the cult and its teachings. By living such kind of distinct and different lives, especially outside of the norms of cultures they see outside of their cult families, they naturally feel an inclination of knowing something others do not. This kind of feeling, this acceptance and belief is in being a more advanced person for the understanding and lifestyle that they are living and leading is what honestly keeps many within the cult families, even though they may feel odd or strange in living that way that they are. The very thing that draws them and makes them feel special is also the thing that causes them stress and an underlying feeling of dread. So social proof in the end is a two-edged sword that both convinces the member of the veracity of their chosen actions within the cult, while also providing the very proof that they are outside the norm of society, something that those looking for a family and to fit in are actually looking for, which is community. So I note all of this about social proof to come back to the very premise of family, because family is so much a part of this. One of the key things, obviously, that you need to have a leader, a cult, is you typically have to have no true Scotsman. Absolutely. That's a great line in and of itself. But you do need to have a cult, typically a charismatic leader. There are a lot of cults out there that have multiple charismatic leaders. But specifically, if you think of David Koresh, we haven't even gotten into Jim Jones and the I just went blank on their name, but we can go into the whole entire concept of what happened down in Guyana, and boy, that's a whole other ballgame. In fact, I'll post a lot of things. You can go back and watch a lot of his sermons and the things that he preached. So charismatic leaders, typically tied to a lot of times to end of times, but social proof is one of the key components of cult behavior that normalizes what would typically be considered external behavior that we would look on as a negative, promiscuity, and a lot of the different things, which, by the way, is an interesting concept for us to look at right now, because where social proof used to have marriages and the rest, where within churches we go, okay, one man, one woman, the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s kind of opened up a whole other realm of sexual perversions. And in fact, it brought about quite a few cults. And one of my favorite and most shocking things I found in studying cults and looking at cults has actually been the fact that a lot of cults have come out of yoga. Uh, I'm thinking of the Rajneeshpuram in the 70s and 80s that ended up moving up to, I think it was Oregon. They bought land up there and the rest. That's another one that I'll post also and let you all see. So Jim Jones, Rajneeshpuram that came out of yoga, but the free love movement, the breakdown of societal norms. And so the more we have the breakdown of societal constructs of what I would consider the norm of faith of Christianity, where you have one woman, one man for life, and the rest, the sexual promiscuity we see, the more cults start to look actually fairly normalized. So the idea of free love, a lot of the things that we would associate with cults in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are now have almost become normalized behavior. Sadly, you look at even what's accepted nowadays from a standpoint of men dressing as women and then dancing in front of children to provocative songs and an overly sexualized nature. And you might go, oh wow, well okay, so he's talking about drag shows and the rest. And then there's the people who will use terminology like family friendly drag shows. What we used to consider cult like behavior and horrific concepts now have become so normalized in culture that social proof, what is it that's making that acceptable? It's social proof. It's the fact that others have accepted it, and thus now, in fact, to speak against it is considered bigoted. It's considered hatred. It's considered something more than what others accept. So, social proof is one of the major aspects of cult behavior that is now becoming very normalized when it comes to these small things, even in our culture today. And so it's something I wanted to lay out before you as we are kind of wrapping up for tonight and the rest of this discussion on cults. Like I said, I have a ton of stuff I'll be sharing with you all the next couple of days in the group to let you all see it, kind of watch some films, some things that you might want to be able to watch, some articles you can read on social proof, on charismatic leaders, on different things that bring about. And I do want you to think through, what does it look like? Scientology and the rest that you can see, probably one of the biggest financial scams also, I would say that. I have no problem saying that. Um, Specifically because at one point in time that church could have been completely shut down, closed down, when they owed, I think it was over $1 billion in back taxes until they were granted, in essence, granted the ability to become a recognized religious group outside of what they were at that time and what they are real in reality, which is a cult. Um, so, Isaac, you just know the idea of free love even occurred in some of the cults that arose in parallel with the Protestant Reformation. Absolutely. In fact, there's cults are not a modern thing, by the way. Cults go back a long time, and so I've got a couple, I think, from the 1500s that I'll share with you also on those. So, if you have any questions or thoughts, please post them in the comment section at any point in time. I am so grateful for all of you who have stuck around and watched this live the whole entire time. I really do enjoy preparing for these things. Um, yeah, the Last Supper behind me. Yeah, I appreciate that. So that's one of my father gave me that a while back, I believe, and it's one of my favorite. I think that's Caravaggio is who that is. So I'm very very interested in this topic, and in fact, I might go down this rabbit hole again. Um, and yeah, they're interested that some cults can receive religious nonprofit sanctions. Absolutely, or sanction, but nonprofit provisions, without a doubt. That is absolutely something, because we are in a culture that allows for these types of things. And so Paul's discussion of mysteries were a direct counter of the cults of his time. Yes, absolutely. So there's so many wonderful conversations we can have on this. So what I'm going to do is I'll post a lot of stuff the next couple of days on this topic. And I may bring up one of these topics again. We may go down the rabbit hole on one specific cult, kind of like what we did a little bit tonight with Eastern Lightning Cult. And I may invite Isaac or Jovan and others, and Nathaniel and others to join me in a live discussion on one of these. I'd love to have you guys on one of these nights. If there's a cult in particular that you'd like to look into or dive into, we could do that at a later date. Love to have that discussion, especially as it ties into our own culture. And that's why I think it's so important. So, like, cults seems like just a fun topic to talk about, but I want us to understand also that cult, the word cult comes out of the premise of culture. And so we are all influenced by culture on a daily basis, and we may not even realize it. And so how we view culture and how we recognize what's happening in our own culture can directly make us, whether or not even our current way we look at the world, have we been social proofed into believing things that are not biblical? Social proofed into accepting things that we would not accept normally, except for everybody else seems to be accepting them. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up tonight. Again, I'm so grateful for your presence tonight and for you all being with me. Thank you for the comments, the questions, and the rest. Please continue to post those. If you're watching after the fact, let us know where you're coming from. Let us know all of those wonderful things. If not, next week we will continue on. Next week, I believe we're diving into intersectionality. And so should be a fascinating discussion on intersectionality. It's a modern concept, a lot of one that has ties to social proof also. So with that in mind, I send you all a wonderful God bless you as you head off into the wild blue yonder of the night as we go out of this rabbit hole until another night. I love you all. Let me know if I can help you in any way, and we'll see you next week.